about an integrated model for promoting health equity, and my co-author on the publication, Divya Saxena, is on our call today, so I'm really glad she could join us. Hello, there's Divya. This model is a way of speaking about critical concepts that link adverse childhood experiences to community health as a means to promote health equity and as a way to lift up the importance of trauma-informed perspectives to community self-healing that promotes the well-being of individuals and families. I'd like to start with NDSU's land acknowledgement, and it is important to consider the context of place. There are 19 tribes, sovereign Native tribes within the geographies of North Dakota and nearby South Dakota and Minnesota. I've had the opportunities over the last 10 years for sure to build relationships with members of some of these communities and other Indigenous colleagues and to come alongside them in my work in public health and to find ways in which my skills as a researcher and evaluator can be of use to them. The work that I am going to be talking about today came out of working with 2 tribal nations on an innovation grant related to the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting grant that is administered in North Dakota by Prevent Child Abuse North Dakota. And with my interest in public health and some of the areas that I teach in, it is important to note that Indigenous people have some of the starkest health disparities in the United States, and these disparities within Indigenous peoples are even more pronounced in the Northern Plains, of course, where NDSU is located. So we collectively acknowledge that we gather at NDSU, a land grant institution on the traditional lands of the Shakoween, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Anishinaabe peoples, in addition to many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to these lands. We honor with gratitude Mother Earth and the Indigenous peoples who've walked with her throughout generations, and we will continue to learn how to live in unity with Mother Earth and build strong, mutually beneficial, trusting relationships with Indigenous peoples of our region. And I'd just like to point out the Native Governance Center, which is a Native-led nonprofit organization that serves Native nations in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. They've put together 2 excellent pages about Indigenous land acknowledgements, including the second one, which has suggestions about how to go beyond the land acknowledgement to support Indigenous peoples and communities. So the title of my talk is the Biopsychosocial Perspective on Health Equity with a Trauma-Informed Lens. And that's one of those fun words, biopsychosocial. It's referring to sort of this intersection of biology, psychology, and social context, and that all of these factors influence our health. So on the biology side, there might be aspects of your gender, illness, disability, maybe genetic vulnerabilities, your immune function, neurochemistry, stress reactivity, medication effects. On the psychology side, how you learn, your memory, your attitudes and beliefs and personality, behaviors, emotions, your coping skills, and it mentions past trauma here. And on social context, we talk about social supports, family background, cultural traditions, our social and economic status and education. And one of my main focuses is on adverse childhood experiences and other aspects of childhood adversity and those lifelong influences. And I'll be talking more about that. But part of what I'm talking about is going to influence immune function on the biology side. It's going to influence coping skills on the psychology side. So they are all very interconnected. But I want to start with a definition of what is equity. This is a field that continues to evolve. I'd say 15 years ago, people were talking about equality, and equality is represented by that first image on the left. It's where it assumes that everyone is going to benefit from the same supports and they're being treated equally. But you can see that that is not a right fit solution for the person on the right, and the person on the left didn't really need the support to begin with. So in that second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. So they are being treated equitably. So initially, a lot of times these images, a lot of you have probably seen them, they stopped there and you didn't have the third panel. So now in the third panel, we can see that the question is, well, why is there this big bulky fence there in the first place? And so when you change the fence, you remove a systemic barrier, and now all three of them can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity in the first place was addressed. So these are some interesting ways to think about sort of the way that thought has transitioned and grown, and ways to think about, at least from in the public health world, how we continue to move upstream and try to have our changes occur at the level that's going to have the greatest effect on people downstream. And so another way that people have shown this image is this one here. And on the right, they've taken out that fence altogether, and you could consider that social justice. So what is fill in the blank inequity? And you can fill in the blank with things like race, ethnicity, nationality, language, legal status, sex, gender, sexual orientation, labor roles and social class markers, disability status, geography, religion. And it's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on those types of characteristics, which unfairly disadvantage some individuals and communities and unfairly advantages others, and can sap the strength of the whole society because it's a waste of human resources for the people who aren't given the opportunity to live to their full potential. How do health disparities arise? They come from differences in the quality of care that's received within the healthcare system, from differences in access to healthcare, including preventive and curative services. And they come from differences in life opportunities, exposures, and stresses that result in differences in the underlying health status. And what we're looking at here are areas that are often described as social determinants of health. Although, again, that's an area that's evolving. There's some research around that phrase is not particularly liked or taken well by the general public. It's not a very accessible phrase. And so they're doing research on how can we better describe what we mean by these areas. So we're talking about economic stability, neighborhood and physical environment, education, access to food, community safety and social context, and our healthcare system. So health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. And that is achieved when every person has the opportunity to attain his or her full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. And health inequities are reflected in differences in length of life, quality of life, rates of disease, disability and death, severity of disease, and access to treatment. And achieving health equity does require that we value all individuals and populations, that we recognize and rectify historical injustices, and that we provide resources according to need. So just for fun, I want you to take a second and think, what is this a picture of? And this is a map of the world according to Fish. I just love this image. So I am going to orient you to my view of the world. As Clayton mentioned, with my background in anthropology, international studies, sociology, human development, the roller coaster is a really good visual for the process of human development. A lot of people think you kind of, you study upward trajectory, maybe a plateau, and then it's this steady decline. And that is not an accurate way to think about human development. It includes gains and losses throughout our life. An essential focus for me is health equity across the life course. My work in education expertise has spanned the life course with a focus on maternal, child, and family health, as well as the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and how to promote equitable access to successful aging. And my focus on community health and well-being and on trauma-informed approaches spans the life course. So the life course perspective emphasizes the lifelong dynamic interplay between a person and their environment. So some principles of the life course theory are that human development and aging are lifelong processes. that our lives are linked interdependently, lived interdependently, and social and historical influences are expressed through this network of our shared relationships, that the developmental impact of life transitions or events is contingent on when they occur in our life, that the life course of an individual is embedded in and shaped by historical times and places that we experience over our lifetime, and that we construct our own life course through the choices and actions we take, but this occurs within the opportunities and constraints of history and social circumstances. Now, one of the things that can be confusing is the use of the term lifespan and life course. And so far, I've been talking about life course, but when I start talking about my model, I'm talking more about lifespan. And so just what I was describing on is on the right-hand side. Life course is focusing more on groups and social pathways, roles and transitions, and it's a very exogenous macro approach. And the genesis of life course theory is really from sociology. And that's the background I brought into my human development studies. Human development actually draws quite a bit from psychology. So there the focus is on more on the individual, on processes and trajectories. It's more endogenous and micro. And really, we best understand sort of the human experience when we use both of these theories. So as I mentioned, development is a lifelong process. It's multidimensional. That's referring to our biopsychosocial dimensionality as well. It's multidirectional. It involves gains and losses. It's characterized by lifelong plasticity, which is the potential for change. And it's really important to highlight this because as I start to talk about trauma in a few slides, a lot of times there's a sense of finality or fatality about it. And, we talk about some of the impacts on a population level, but none of them are predictive on an individual level because we all have this plasticity. And so this lifelong plasticity is really a source of hope. It's something to be, really grateful for and to remember. We're shaped by the historical, cultural context. It requires multiple disciplines to really understand. And some of the themes are that we have so many individual differences, we're adaptive, and that we have capacity for self-regulation. So here's the model, and we're going to start on the outside of the model. So if you see that very large circle on the left, this is the outside of the socio-ecological model, which explains multiple levels of influence. It's the idea that the individual interacts within relationships, communities is the next layer, and society, and that the experiences of the individual are also rooted in the context of time and place, including historical trauma. And this model shows how the ACEs pyramid, so the adverse childhood experiences research is often encapsulated with the concept of this pyramid, and it shows where this pyramid fits into the socio-ecological model, which is at that individual level at the center. And then I also provide examples of the language associated at each level related to achieving health equity. At the individual level, we're talking about how our personal history interconnects with our biology. For those of you who studied epigenetics, the allostatic load we carry, the impact of stress on our body and our immune systems. At the relationship level, we're talking about our friends, our family, our peers. We can experience intergenerational trauma that's been transmitted, adverse childhood experiences. And at the community level, we have our social and physical environments, and also where we experience adverse community experiences. It's not just what's happening within our home. And that can be violence in the community and experiences of racism. And at the societal level as well. And then you have the structures, systems, and policies and the overall norms that influence our efforts to create health equity. So I have found that a lot of really important conversations about health equity kind of seem disconnected from one another. I'm a person who likes to kind of dip my finger in a lot of different ponds. I don't know what analogy I'm going for there, but and then I see, well, you know what? People are kind of speaking about the same thing, but they're using different language and they're not really talking to each other. And they really seem disconnected, but really they're all quite synergistic. So the social determinants of health are really related to those community and societal levels of the socioecological model. Practices in public health to move upstream and make changes at the policy systems and environmental levels, those are really related to that socioecological model. So just some examples as I move forward of kind of where we're going with this overall model. I mentioned social determinants of health. So inside the socioecological model, just examples of how social determinants of health can fit into the community and societal levels in terms of our built environment and our neighborhoods, economic stability and opportunity happening at the societal level, and health and healthcare, social community context, education can often span both of those levels. And then to note there that the historical trauma and the context of time and place are at the root. And it's important to talk about racism as a form of trauma. It creates ongoing stress, and children internalize the stress of racism from a very young age. And it can also get expressed as cultural trauma, an attack on the fabric of a community and a culture and society, which affects the very essence of the community and its members. There are different examples of historical trauma that different peoples in the United States have experienced, but the historical trauma experienced by Indigenous peoples is a, really salient thing to educate people about who are in the North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota region. Historical trauma can be defined as collective emotional wounding across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events. And this trauma is held personally and transmitted over generations. There are numerous examples of historical trauma that are impacting families and communities that, many of us interact with every day. Intergenerational trauma occurs when trauma is not resolved. It can be subsequently internalized and passed from one generation to the next. And that's part of why it's a challenge to talk about historical trauma because of that word historical. Because when people hear that word, they tend to think it's something in the past, but really it is still very much a present influence. It's in the ways that people relate to one another, in their bodies, their daily thoughts. And there are many older adults, for example, older Indigenous people who have experienced boarding schools firsthand. So it is not even that long ago of a history. It's impacted traditional parenting practices, and many tribal nations are seeking to reclaim language and cultures that policies like boarding schools stripped away, and are really making tremendous strides towards healing and thriving. But it's coming from a context of atrocities that were committed against them. So now we're going to move to the right-hand side of the model, and I'm going to talk about that ACEs pyramid. ACEs can include physical and mental abuse and neglect, as well as dynamics in the household, like a parent with mental illness or substance use disorder, incarceration of a caregiving adult, violence in the home, and divorce or separation. And cumulative experiences of chronic unpredictable stress in childhood can lead to neurodevelopmental and physiological adaptations to what the body will perceive as a malevolent environment. And these changes can in turn lead to social, emotional, physical, and cognitive functioning that does not meet the demands of the everyday world very well, and can lead to coping techniques that lead to health risks. So for those of you who are on your computers right now, I'd like you to pull up a website called menti.com. And for those of you in the audience there, please just pull out your smartphones and go to menti.com. And I'd just like to get a bit of a sense of the knowledge base among participants about adverse childhood experiences research. So the code to use, I'm going to pop this into chat, is 49425284. Did I get that right? Okay. And then I'm going to some of you are already responding. So how would you describe your level of knowledge? Very knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, not at all knowledgeable. Sorry about that. I want to bring my PowerPoint back. Here we go. Just give it a few more seconds. Got 20 respondents so far. Looks like kind of a split between those who feel very knowledgeable and others who don't have really any familiarity. And then quite a few who have, feel somewhat knowledgeable. So this is not a presentation where I'm going to go into the details of the ACEs research. I've been trained as a master trainer in ACEs, and the materials that we have at our disposal include enough to, do two-day workshop. So you're going to get a very shortened version here. So thank you to those who have responded. Helpful for me to get a sense of what's all right. So we each experience a different path in life, but for illustration, I invite you to imagine just two worlds. The top world is a malevolent world. It's a mean and dangerous world. And the bottom world is a benevolent world. It's kind and generous. On the top path, children are going to grow up with sustained danger, and the brain prepares itself for living in a dangerous world. And in the absence of buffering relationships and supports, the brain can also struggle to develop healthy neural networks. On the top path, characteristics like being hypervigilant are actually functional adaptations that can help a person survive. But those adaptations may not be so helpful when they're asked to be part of everyday expectations, like sitting still at school, or as an adult trying to self-regulate during complicated tasks or when dealing with unpleasant coworkers. Advances in neuroscience shed light on why ACEs are so powerful, because humans are really only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time, long enough to prepare to fight, flight, or freeze. And that's why we call trauma and continuous stress and recurring unpredictable stress toxic stress, because experiences that cause stress chemicals to be continuously produced can have a big impact on development. And then that gets integrated into the body as a person grows into adulthood. And a growing brain that is exposed to sustained danger generates predictable patterns of brain architecture, behavior, and traits. And what happens in our lives determines what gets wired into the brain as it develops. Infants are born with only the connections and brain functions that they need immediately. Most of the wiring of our brain occurs as a result of life experience over the coming years. And children who've experienced the malevolent path have connections that are wired into their brain based on those experiences, and fewer of the connections associated with the benevolent path. And this is an image of a normal brain on the left with a high level of brain activity in the temporal lobes. The temporal lobes are responsible for regulating emotions and receiving input from the senses. On the right, these are the temporal lobes of a severely traumatized child, and you can see that they're nearly inactive. And children with underdevelopment of the temporal lobes may experience severe emotional and cognitive problems, as well as have difficulty in making and sustaining positive relationships. So there are many negative effects of childhood abuse and neglect on how the brain develops. And some of these potential effects are in processing emotions and determining reactions to potentially stressful or dangerous situations. Decrease in the size of the hippocampus can impact learning and memory. A decrease in the size of the cerebellum can affect motor skills and coordination. A decrease in the size of the corpus callosum impacts functioning of emotion, our impulses, communication between the right and left brain hemispheres, and a decrease in the volume of the prefrontal cortex can affect behavior, balancing of emotions and perceptions. And cortisol levels that are too high can lead to inflammation, and that can interfere with the immune system. Conversely, you can also have ones that are too low, levels that are too low. And so what trauma's impact on the brain is going to look like to others are, you know, are you interacting with somebody who can ignore stimuli that doesn't really bother others? Are they hypervigilant? I'll say we because I'm a person with a high ACE score myself. Do we interpret something as threatening that others perceive as neutral? How quickly and with what intensity do we experience negative emotional reactions? How quickly can we recover emotional regulation? Behavioral reactivity, are we inhibited or uninhibited? Is it out of proportion to the situation? And what coping strategies are we using in our decision making? The impact of ACEs shows up across an incredible array of areas. The ACEs study was really the first to look at the accumulation of adverse experiences, and they found the dose response. And this means that more ACEs is basically correlates with more health problems as an adult. And the dose response relationship reflects the cumulative stress and developmental adaptations that accompany a high ACE score. We're not going to go through the ACE score. You can find this online. It is important to recognize the principles here that Dr. Anda, co-principal investigator of the original study, shares that it's not a diagnostic tool or a screening tool or a predictor at the individual level, but it is a history tool, and it's a communication tool and a gateway to empathy, compassion, and healing. And so the simple way to find out your ACE score is to answer these 10 questions. And if you answer yes, then each one of those would get tallied and would be your ACE score. And it's those things I mentioned related to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, neglect, and then aspects of household dysfunction like violence in the home or mental illness or substance abuse of a parent. And what I will share with you is some groups that I have had more time with and have gotten their ACE scores. The one on the left was from earlier, I guess just about a month ago. And this was an audience of NDSU students. And here, 41% of NDS students had an ACE score of 0. This is actually a little bit higher than sort of the kind of the general baseline that the ACE study and many studies that replicate it, such as the behavior risk factor surveillance system that collects data every state, every year. Many states have ACEs questions on there. So 41% is good. It means, you know, a larger proportion of students couldn't identify with any of those adverse childhood experiences. But some of the feedback from those students was they just really had no idea that others did have those experiences, or how many of their classmates, in fact, had experienced, 4 or more. And that's about 16%. And then the group on the right is a group I presented to about a year ago, and 29% had an ACE score of 0. Okay, so, significantly smaller. And then they had double the rate of people with an ACE score of 4 or higher. So compared to 16% on the left, this group was 31% who had an ACE score of 4 or higher. And you do find, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that you do find people tend to track into, a lot of people have had experiences where they've benefited from the intervention of, social worker, counselor, psychiatrist, can be drawn to those fields. So this graphic illustrates the many different areas of our lives in which early adversity can have lasting impacts. Injury, mental health, maternal health, infectious disease, chronic disease, risky behaviors, and access to opportunities. Because of these powerful impacts demonstrated at a population level, ACEs can be described as the leading cause of health and social problems in our nation, and is often called the epidemiology of childhood. We can see this discovery coming from the ACEs study in the 1990s as providing a really powerful opportunity to shift both how we interact with adults who are impacted by ACEs and how we work to prevent ACEs, both any ACEs and also the accumulation of ACEs, to keep a child going from 1 or 2 ACEs to 4 or more ACEs. And that really does improve the trajectory of health and well-being for generations to come. So here I'm showing you where this ACE pyramid fits right there within the socioecological model. And now I'm going to focus on the community level, the relationship and community level of the model, because this is an extremely powerful arena in which community members can really directly see the benefits of their efforts, and which then can also cause change at the societal level. We really shouldn't be afraid of and try to avoid all stress, because stress does contribute to healthy development. It's an essential piece of building our resilience to the ups and downs of life. But we can think of stress in terms of 3 types. Positive stress is going to be more brief and moderate. The physiological response can return to normal, healthy levels pretty quickly. On the right, you see the toxic stress, the severe, chronic, prolonged stress that is not a normal part of development. And then you have what you would call tolerable stress in the middle. It's serious, but generally short term. Some stresses are going to automatically be categorized as toxic, like abuse and neglect, but some stresses may be tolerable or even move into the positive sphere, depending on the resources available to us. This also means that tolerable stress that is not buffered by a relationship with a caring, competent adult can become toxic stress. So supportive relationships with adults can help restore our body's response to tolerable stress back to that healthy baseline, and can make it even into an experience of positive stress. Furthermore, there's that little image of the fulcrum, the teeter-totter or seesaw, depending on where you grew up, I think. When you increase the number of positive experiences that a child is experiencing, it can help balance the shift towards more positive outcomes. And this is also true among adults who have high ACE scores, where you can foster a sense of hope and provide access to concrete support. I'm going to talk more about what these protective factors are, but we can have a really positive impact on people who are living with high ACE scores today. So talking about how to promote healthy individuals within the context of healthy communities, I really like this image. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment it grows in, not the flower. So what are some examples of positive experiences that can help tip that scale and allow people to thrive even with the adversity that they've experienced? And research right now is showing promise related to these protective systems, individual capabilities, attachment and belonging, and protective community, faith, and cultural contexts. We do know that people do best when the 3 protective systems are nested. So you want people to be living in thriving families and communities. So when we talk about individual capabilities that are associated with recovery and resilience, one of the challenges is that these capabilities are often the same capabilities that do not develop well because of toxic stress, that it's impacted their neurodevelopment. So believing that people can just try harder to be different than what their biological adaptations have created for them, it's a circular logic that can sometimes feel like victim blaming and be very discouraging for individuals who are experiencing the lack of those particular skills. So this also leads us to the other systems of support. So this is the idea of layering up these resiliency factors. And I believe in the state of Washington, in their behavioral risk factor surveillance system, they ask about these protective factors. And I'll show you an example of the impact of the data. It's pretty powerful. So feeling social, emotional support and fostering of hope having 2 or more people who can help you, specifically giving concrete help when needed, community reciprocity in watching out for children, intervening when they're in trouble, doing favors for one another, and also social bridging, people reaching outside their social circle to get help for their family and friends. So this is an illustration of the protective power of high support, and this was measured as usually, answers of usually or always feeling socially and emotionally supported. So what you see in the dark blue lines are people who have a sense of low support and hope. And you do see that same dose response where you start with a lower level for people with 0 ACEs and a higher level with 4 to 8 ACEs. But what you see when they have a high level of support and hope is that even among the people with high ACEs, those rates are, a little bit outside of the confidence intervals, but they're functioning so much better. So just really a powerful example here of the impact that high support and hope will have on mental health. So as part of the maternal infant early childhood home visiting services that I was a part of, we had applied for innovation grant funding in 2016. And I mentioned this earlier in the presentation that this is where we decided to come up with this model, in part to sort of help explain some of what our foundational concepts were. We were really trying to answer the question of how could we improve the outcomes for home visiting participants. And in our case, we wanted to focus on that socio-ecological model. We knew that would be an important concept, and basically recognizing that our home visiting families, these are families that are pregnant or have young children, that they're not islands, that they're impacted by historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and ACEs. We use the language of the self-healing community framework to help explain to others what the innovation project that we were doing was trying to achieve. And when I talk about the key principles of this framework, and I talk about trauma-informed approaches in a moment, you're going to see that these principles are very consistent. So a self-healing community is where you really have inclusive leadership that is including the people who are most impacted by the trauma. You have recurring cycles of learning and change. It's not a static process. You don't get wed to a single idea. You recognize that things change. You focus on community capacity building and leaving communities better than when you started or entered them. A shared understanding of the science of adverse childhood experiences. The group who does the master training, ACE interface, Dr. Anda, that co-PI from the original ACE study, and Laura Porter are the ones who coined the phrase near science, and that refers to advances in neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, and resiliency research that really helps explain the mechanisms of how trauma is impacting individuals and communities. Also creating solutions that are a good fit for the resources of the community and nurturing feelings of hope and efficacy. And similar to the other graphic, shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail people. So the idea that you can't always just lift yourself up by your bootstraps, that idea of self-care, that you really need community care. So in the model, we included examples of integrating trauma-informed perspectives, just related to the arrows there. So for example, acknowledging trauma and fostering healing-centered social justice, fostering empowerment, building parenting skills, mentoring, using trauma-informed, resiliency-focused, human-centered, strengths-based lens to build self-healing communities, and addressing social determinants of health and racism. The core principles of a trauma-informed approach. Trauma-informed as a concept originally came from the clinical care setting, but it is being actively applied to other settings. And the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has generated a guide, the guiding principles of trauma-informed care that are widely used and referred to. So this is coming from SAMHSA, that trauma-informed approach is built on 6 principles. Safety, and this is both physical and psychological safety, trustworthiness and transparency. The goal is really to build and maintain trusting relationships. Peer support, where others with a shared experience of trauma are seen and acknowledged as experts in their own lived experiences. That there's collaboration and mutuality, and that includes leveling power differences and sharing decision-making in an authentic way. It includes empowerment, providing voice, providing choice, where individual and community strengths are recognized and built upon, as well as humility and responsiveness to cultural, historical, and gender issues. That includes recognizing historical trauma and being responsive to racial, ethnic, cultural aspects, as well as gender and geography of the people that you're working with. Additionally, there's the 4 R's of trauma-informed approaches. This is getting at what you can do, what it means to operate in a trauma-informed way. One is to realize the widespread impact of trauma and to understand potential pathways to recovery. The second R is to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma among people in our lives. This can include our classmates, our coworkers, our neighbors, and certainly our clients and other people that we'll be serving in our professions. Respond by integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies and practices. Every different discipline is working. This is really a burgeoning field. There's trauma-sensitive schools is a approach that is being championed in North Dakota and having really positive impacts. There's changes to how juvenile justice and correction systems are working. And when those are in place, they're having really positive impacts. So depending on your discipline, if you search for trauma-informed approaches, you're probably going to find some people who are actively out there working on what that looks like in your field. And the last R is to resist re-traumatization. And this means actively resisting triggering trauma reactions. Sometimes I include a slide in this presentation that's about avoiding, they call sanctuary trauma. And it's the idea that people who are entering a place that's supposed to be a helping system, a hospital, a counseling center, just the way that a place is structured physically, how it's designed, how the lights are, how information is communicated, those can be inadvertently triggering trauma reactions. So I'm nearly wrapping up, and then I hope to have a few minutes for questions. So here's just an example of when would we think trauma? And the answer would be always, and especially when someone is acting irritable, if they're avoiding appointments or procedures, they might be ambivalent about their health, if they're showing symptoms of depression, if there's a history of substance abuse, if they have chronic problems with pain. And you can be respectfully curious. I've noticed that you've been missing your appointments. I'm wondering what's going on there. One of the goals that I would seek for NDSU would be to create a workforce that recognizes the presence of trauma and the importance of supporting resilience and hope. This is going to require leadership support. It takes staff engagement and time. It's going to move in care settings from being more task-oriented to person-centered. It's going to be about maintaining familiarity with community resources and that sense of support that can be made available, being interprofessional, multidisciplinary, developing a shared understanding of trauma-informed approaches, and considering the role that trauma may be playing in difficulties that people may be having, as well as communicating in clear, concise, and positive ways. And this is something that I think reflects kind of when I started at the beginning about how there's a shift in language from equality to equity and equity to justice. And here it's the idea that I'm more than just what happened to me. I'm not just my trauma. So some people, want to change the frame from being trauma informed to well, always we want to be strengths based. But, saying trauma-informed can feel like it's coming from a negative place. And so there's a focus on this concept of being healing-centered. So really, there is a challenge to find the right way to talk about it. And I think the phrases we use, will be maybe more appropriate in some situations than others. But really, what's important is to change the question from, like, what's wrong with you? And people get frustrated and irritated, to what happened to you, which is a much more compassionate place to come from. And also ask what's right with you. You've survived some things that have really made you a strong person, and let's build on that. So we really want to foster health equity using trauma-informed approaches. And I contend that communities that experience significant health disparities are going to have trauma as a part of their collective story. But if they don't, if there isn't trauma, I would say trauma-informed principles are still good for everyone. So why not? So thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking some questions. And I also am happy to hear from anybody who would want to contact me. That's my email address.
Great, thank you. Much applause here. I don't know if you can hear it, but there is some applause
but thank you.
as well. Thank you, Ramona. That was very interesting. Does anybody have any questions? I'm seeing some questions online. If you want to unmute yourself and just ask your question, we can do that.
Hi, Dr. Danielson. It's Raleigh.
Hi, Raleigh.
So I was wondering about, you had a slide, it said that ACE scores or risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. And I know that there's the dose effect where, like, the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to experience adverse health. So do the predictive factors and the protective factors, do they help the physical health too? They buffer that?
Well, that's an excellent question. I thought maybe you were going to ask whether they have that cumulative effect as well, and they do. The more that you layer things up, I would say that one of okay, so this is my experience as a person. With an ACE score of 6. Your sort of ability for self-care might be impacted. So having that concrete support around you, also maybe having some more tangible ways to be addressing stress, because stress is just so hard on our bodies. I would say that would probably be the mechanism through which we would be able to see improved physical health. That's what comes to mind right now. I'll do some more thinking about that. That's a really good question.
Thanks.
Other questions? Delia. What's the goals of future research in the area? And so there's a lot going on with the ACEs in terms of what happens to the individual and what happens to the individual within the community. So Ilya is interested in where research is going next.
Okay. There's a lot of research into the protective factors. People want to know, what is it that's going to sort of give you the biggest impact for the effort. So if you have federal grants that have money for implementation, where should that money be emphasized? So that's, when I see notice of funding opportunities, there's a lot about that. On one level, they're still actually just doing surveillance. They want just better data out there to really understand and explore that better, but more understanding about protective factors. I guess that's going to impact children in terms of that buffering, but that's also going to impact people who are adults with those impacts. And then as was noted in the beginning, part of my interest is in successful aging. So personally, I'm looking also at research to better understand how to allow aging adults with a history of trauma to achieve successful aging. And I see that as a health equity issue. Aging already is challenging. And so when you layer that up, so I did just recently publish an article about aging in place and trauma-informed perspectives. It was a scoping review, and essentially we found that there isn't a lot of exploration right now on what is considered sort of this best practice for older adults to be able to maintain that independence. It doesn't always have to mean living in the same home, but being able to have a choice essentially and for independence. And so that's an area that I'm also looking to pursue. And then on the prevention side, just what is most preventive? So there's a lot of research, for example, in the field of home visiting about, there's a lot of different home visiting models. There's Nurse Family Partnership, Parents as Teachers, Healthy Families America. They all have similar principles in terms of, essentially they're doing the concrete support. They're trying to connect them, do that social bridging. So, they're building some of that supportive structure that I gave examples of. But, what is the dose? Do you need 2 visits a month for 2 years, or could you have the maximum benefit at 6 months? So really understanding, with the limited resources, what is going to be most preventive? What is best practice? There's some really exciting practices that the federal government, of course, wants evidence-based practices, and you have to be cautious about making sure that those evidence-based practices aren't overgeneralized. So, working with Indigenous communities that, models of home visiting whose basis of evidence is middle-class people in Missouri, so kind of looking to see where things replicate or how do you culturally adapt to communities. There's a lot of interest in recognizing that solutions need to be place-based and right fit, and so how do you do that? Because people want to come up with something that's like a one-size-fits-all solution because, we want to have the biggest impact, but really, the main denominator is that you really have to be focused and localized to the community. But a lot of my teaching and work is also around best practices for research and evaluation, and I would say even just implementation with especially communities experiencing health disparities. And one of the biggest areas of excitement, I would say, is recognizing that the communities themselves are the expert in their own communities. So instead of coming in with our own ideas of what's going to work, first of all, we need to be invited in and that it be a partnership, and that some of those trauma-informed approaches there in terms of safety and transparency and community building, community capacity building. And so there's, I think, a lot of interest in sort of how do you figure out what those solutions are on a community by community basis. So really then what is generalizable is the method by which you go into communities and build relationships. And I do think people want to cut corners. Unfortunately, that's in the best case scenario does not have any benefit, and the worst case scenario actually causes harm in communities and in Indigenous communities and other communities that have experienced racism and other factors. There's a well-earned distrust of certain things, coming from the federal government, history of abuses and research, those types of things. So there's definitely, I think, a lot to learn. Part of my goal is of being an ally of people of color and of my colleagues and friends that are Indigenous in the communities that I work in, is to figure out how to be the most effective ally. What is it they need from us? And so I would say a lot of the areas for research will be coming from what the communities say they need when we take the time to authentically ask them.
Great, very interesting stuff going on. Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
I have a quick question, which is, in your answer to Ilya's question, you mentioned protective and preventative, but one of the hot terms that I remember us talking about is resilience, and where the research is with
Did you hear
that
me
now.
not use that word?
I did hear
you
you
notice?
not use that word, so I didn't know if public health is pulling away from using that word because it was such a trigger sort of word, or
It's
what, but
tricky.
yeah.
What is your question? Sorry, I'm
No,
responding.
I mean, the question is
resilience.
where would you characterize that work on resilience right now? You had a slide, I think, that listed 4 characteristics of resilience, and I would say all 4 characteristics were related to social support, having a community around you that is supportive, having other people who can step in and help you. Is that, you think, where we're at with resilience right now? Is it has a lot to do with how we interact with our communities?
Yes, I would say that's a good takeaway. What is interesting, and as I, because of course I'm presenting some things to this audience that I've never put in a presentation like this, because I'm talking to psychologists, and that's a different audience for me. And I don't want to imply, first of all, that's why I was emphasizing that plasticity and that human agency. I mean, we know there's an incredible capacity for resilience. But when we're talking about health equity at the population level, rather than sort of at the individual level, we just have to, recognize that's the point I was making about resilience. Is it's one of those tricky words, because sometimes it's like, well, you just need to have more friends. You just need to be more easygoing. You just need to breathe more. I don't mean to be dismissive, but things that literally have been hardwired into their bodies, and maybe they can get to that point, but they're not necessarily going to start there. So I tend to not use the word resiliency, because I think it can end up feeling really bad for the people who, quote unquote, aren't resilient, that there ends up being sort of a blame and shame piece to that. I would say on the resiliency side, external to the individual then is where the protective factors come in. And that's from a public health standpoint. And, I guess from the sociological standpoint, that's where I'm coming from with protective factors. But that is definitely a word that's tricky. Then people are kind of working on like sort of how to best define that. And part of the solution is to just not use the word.
Yeah. Great. Well, no, that's really interesting. And I think it's really interesting to think about it as a community or a social factor, and even though most of us think of it as an individual factor. Very interesting. Any other questions online or in the room? Yep, I have another question in the room here that I'll transfer to you once I hear it.
I'm assuming Dr. Hilmert is
Yeah,
listening and will be relaying.
Yep. Okay. So has anybody looked at how ACEs are affected at the community level? So in other words, somebody who may have a number of ACEs, are they stigmatized? How are they treated in the community? What other effects of the community are there on people with ACEs?
I would say that there's probably not a lot of stigma right now around a quote unquote ACE score, because people, that language isn't really in the general vernacular. And I think the people who do know, if you mention your ACE score, you're going to be in a doctor's office, and that's actually going to help inform, that practitioner's sense of maybe where you're coming from, right? So that's where Dr. Anda talks about it as being a tool for communication. Where I would say the stigma that's definitely out there is in what are the consequences of high ACEs. And part of why a lot of people, including myself, see, sharing knowledge about ACEs as a social justice issue is because it changes the way you think about some of our societal problems and also what the solutions are. So I'm gonna give a statistic that I know is not exactly correct, but the association between a high ACE score and intravenous drug use is something like an 1100% increase. And you just don't find those kinds of associations. So, you're gonna see a lot of people who are very judgmental about IV drug addicts and people who are homeless and people who are just really struggling with mental health, and all of those things are on a population level strongly associated with ACE scores. And I keep making that distinction because it's not that you're going to see, okay, you have an ACE score of 6, therefore you have been homeless, you have been right. I mean, that's from a sense of an epidemiology perspective, you see patterns that are really important, but it's not predictive at the individual level. So that's where I think the stigma is. Does that help? Is there follow-up?
Follow-up.
Compassion, that's what I feel comes out of sharing the ACEs knowledge, is a lot of people have more compassion. I hear a lot of people, I've had people be like, oh, I bet that helps me understand my one coworker better who's super annoying. Or, I presented to a long-term care association meeting one time, and they're like, oh, that really helps me understand some of those really difficult clients better. Just compassion.
I guess what I'm also interested in is the individual ACE factors. So for example, being the child of a parent who abuses drugs, or being a child who was in the foster care system due to abuse or negligence.
Is there stigma? Is that the rest of the?
Right, that kind of impact.
I may need a little bit more explanation of the question, but and I would love to visit with you. You're welcome to send an email and we can visit. And I would offer that to Elia as well. It looks like she had some more, some more follow-up questions to my answer to her question. So feel free to reach out. But I guess what I would say is that the association that is studied at the ACE score level, that dose response is really looking at sort of that high level. You're kind of like, buffing down the high, the ups and downs. Like, it's not looking at the actual dose of, how many times did that happen to you? What age did that happen to you? And so, when I'm presenting longer presentations, there's research about how, physical impact, physical abuse of a boy at this age is more likely to affect this part of the brain than a female. But sexual abuse of the female at this age is more likely to impact her brain in this way than it would for a male. So, those individual experiences do still matter. And lots of people are doing research into specific, they're diving deep into specific issues. And what happens with something like foster care, when I think of, people will say, well, the list of 10 ACEs, if you've gone out and found it yet, hopefully you're still listening. That happened one time where I lost people. They just went up and looked up their ACE score, and I was like, oh, now look it up later, please. When you look up your ACE score and you'll be like, well, that's not a comprehensive list. Well, it's definitely not a comprehensive list. But those tend to be ones that are common enough and interrelated enough that they capture that sense of dose response, of the cumulative dose of toxic stress. But there are other things that contribute as well. And that's another area of research, by the way, into what are some of these other factors. And people are specifically looking into adverse community factors as well. There's a great image that I have that's kind of representing adverse adverse experiences in the home, adverse experiences in the community, and then the impact of climate, natural disasters and climate change as well. Not to go too far down a rabbit hole there. And so if you were, there isn't a question specifically about where you put in foster care, but what it's really about is, was there a disruption to, your attachments, that you were developing? And, what was what was available to you in terms of buffering the stress of being put in a foster home? Was it a particularly good home, or was it a home that in fact created different types of stress? So each of those areas, there are people out there, doing really in-depth research into the impacts of all of those different types of adversity. But I personally, I'm focused on kind of understanding that cumulative effect.
Okay, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Good.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I want to once again thank Dr. Danielson for her time. That was excellent presentation. I really found it very interesting. Thank you very much.
I heard claps there. Yes, you're most welcome. I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to share with you all. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ramona. And I want to thank everybody for their time and attention this semester. This is the last colloquium of the semester. I wish you all a happy finals week and a wonderful holiday season. Thank you all. Take care.
Oh, Berlin just got off. I was going to